What sorts of things drive you? You both are working so hard. You're activists. You never stop reading and writing. You're passionately engaged in the world. And I wonder what's driving you both. What's motivating you? What's important to you? To make you...
What's important?
What's important?
Looking in the mirror in the morning and not being appalled at what I see.
For me, it's looking out the window and not being appalled at what I see.
So in other words, you're really concerned about feeling that in your life you've done all you can do to
I know I haven't done anywhere near what I could do, which is why I often am appalled when I look in the mirror. But looking out the window and seeing what's there. And
you feel the responsibility as an intellectual.
Not as an intellectual, just a human being.
As a human being.
I mean, I think it's a kind of funny question. The question that ought to be, like a lot of questions, it's the wrong one.
Yeah.
The question that ought to be asked is, why doesn't everybody engage themselves, recognize that they're not engaging themselves enough, because none of us are, even saints, in trying to help deal with the problems of suffering people.
Also, what is there in our society that makes empathy in such short supply? I'm more shocked by that in other people in every society, the inability to picture what it is like to be somebody else. Now, my profession as a novelist, I have to do that. I become other people. But I've always had that tendency, and I'm always startled when I start to talk to people who start going on about how much they hate the blacks or the Jews or the gay people, and you suddenly see there is no ability to identify with anyone else except themselves. And I suppose if I had a motivating thing, it probably would come out in an overwrought empathy and irritability at its absence in others.
Now, in conversation, Gore Vidal and Noam Chomsky.
I'll give you a little picture. I like to do little pictures. 2 years ago, Rights of Man in Paris, 200th anniversary, and I'm there to talk about it on television. And all the chiefs of state from all the world are there, and the whole center of Paris is cordoned off. The day after, I'm trying to get out of the hotel. Suddenly down the empty streets comes this black limousine with 2 American flags, and the presidential seal is George Bush and Barbara and the Secret Service. And they go slowly down the street, and I have to walk a couple blocks still trying to find a way to get out of there. They comes back up the street. They're lost. All their marking time. And no one had paid any attention to the Emperor of the West in Paris at this meeting. And I said to myself, this is an odd thing to see the Emperor of the West drifting around the streets of Paris. He's going to have to think of something to do. And he did.
He decided to invade a little country?
A war, as war is the usual diversion. His son was possibly, allegedly going to prison for his S&L efforts. The cost of bailing out the S&Ls, according to that radical paper, the Wall Street Journal, it will be slightly more than the entire cost of World War II to the United States in today's dollars. So there's a lot to divert attention from. That, to me, was the point of the war. There are obviously subtext, but that's the central one in my mind.
I agree with you on the diversion. I mean, there are many audiences that had to be addressed by this operation. One of them is the American population, who have to be diverted not just from the S&Ls, but from the whole growing social and economic catastrophe around them, which has been very much accelerated in the Reagan-Bush years. And in fact, after all, this is not the first time. There have been periodic episodes of exactly this sort right through the 1980s. There's been repeated huge propaganda efforts establishing some awesome chimera about to destroy us, and then we're miraculously rescued at the last minute. International terrorists, and you bomb Libya and we're saved. Narco traffickers, and you smash up Panama and we're saved. Even Grenada, 100,000 people, was set up as a major threat to our existence with an airfield, going to interdict sea traffic in the Caribbean and so on, and then we're saved and so on. And that's standard. I mean, you have to divert. You want to make sure that the population doesn't think about what's around them and maybe do something about it. Obviously, that's one audience, but the international scene is, well, that's one part of it, but there's more. I think the imperial element is also significant. The third world has to be taught a lesson. They have to be taught a lesson that if you step on our toes, you don't just get beaten, you get pulverized. And in fact, the administration was kind enough to give us that story in their own words. They leaked, just as the so-called ground war was not a war, the ground operation was beginning, they leaked a section of a national security policy review from the early days of the Bush administration, so long before this. And it was a section on third world threats. And what it said was something like this. It said, in the case of a much weaker enemy, it is not enough to defeat them. You have to defeat them decisively and rapidly, because anything else would be too embarrassing and might undercut political support. So the trick is you find a much weaker enemy, build them up to be a major, monstrous force, menacing force.
Saddam Hussein,
then defeat them, or Noriega, was done just a year ago with Noriega. Defeat them decisively and rapidly, and that's the only way you can keep political support. And that's a lesson to the third world, but it's also a lesson to the world as a whole. I mean, the United States no longer is the overwhelmingly dominant economic force in the world as it was for many years. It's now just one of three. But in military force, it ranks supreme, and it has every reason to want confrontations in the world shifted to the military arena, because the domain of force is where the United States is dominant, and you play your strong card in any confrontation. U.S. card happens to be force. Furthermore, it's more intricate because the U.S. no longer has the economic base to carry out the traditional role of third world intervention. It therefore has to become, as the business press has been very frank in pointing out, has to become a mercenary state. Others are going to have to pay for these adventures, and one source of payment is petrodollars. One of the major sources of capital in the world is the profits from energy production, and the United States wants to make sure, as it has long wanted to make sure, that those profits are fed primarily to support the U.S. economy and, of course, the economy of its lieutenant in these operations, namely Britain. That goes way back.
What about the standard argument here, though, Noam, that Saddam Hussein really is a bad guy,
Yeah, sure
that he did do a terrible thing in invading his neighboring country, Kuwait, that he did subject the Kuwaiti people to terrible tortures, and that he also was probably building up a nuclear arsenal? But these were all, so in many ways there was a justification for this war.
Well, look, all of those things are true, and they were all true on August 1st. On August 1st, when it was true in 1980. In 1980, Saddam Hussein was basically a Russian client. Reagan and Bush and Thatcher recognized him as our kind of guy, and they worked very hard for several years to switch him over to the U.S. side. In 1982, he was taken off the list of terrorist states so that they could then get huge U.S. credits to buy U.S. exports. Became one of the leading the U.S. became one of his leading trading partners. By 1987. Iraq was largely a Western, dependent on the West, also for the buildup of its extensive weapons of mass destruction and so on. When he did things like, say, gassing the Kurds in 1988, the Reagan administration intervened to prevent Congress from condemning it in any serious way, let alone to stop sanctions. This went right on to 1990. I mean, in July 1990, Bush intervened again to try to prevent the House Foreign Affairs Committee from condemning Saddam Hussein, or it did impose some sanctions that would interfere with American business. In fact, on August 1st, while they were getting not only warnings, but direct statements from the CIA saying the invasion was coming, on August 1st, the White House authorized new high-technology shipments to Iraq. In the preceding 2 weeks, up to August 1st, they had authorized, according to what's been made public so far, who knows the real story, but what's been made public so far, they authorized almost $5 million worth of high-technology aid.
To go to Iraq.
It went not just to Iraq, it went to the Ministry of Military Industry. It went to the nuclear research plant that was later bombed on the grounds that it was producing military bombs, and to a chemical, to another plant that was bombed on the grounds that it was producing chemical and biological weapons. Now, that was 2 weeks before. And it's true that the invasion of Kuwait was a crime, but, his record was so sordid that what it added to it is very slight and was of no concern to the United States.
So this makes no sense. What's the turning point?
The turning point is he stepped on our toes. Well, that you don't do. I mean, by the standards of the United States and Britain, you can guess your population, you can torture, you can murder, you can set up one of the most brutal tyrannies in the world. That's all fine as long as you're Arab thug. Yes. But he did something on August 2nd, which is impermissible. He was told, we don't care very much if you rectify border problems, but he took over Kuwait, and that's not allowed. We run the oil business, and when anybody steps on our toes, especially if they're much weaker, then they get not only defeated, but pulverized. That's the lesson that has to be learned. Don't step on our toes.
You speak of the lesson to the second and third world countries. Even more important, apropos of my vision of an aimless president drifting lost in Paris, ignored by other leaders, this was a message, a lesson to the first world. That not only was the Soviet Union off the world stage as an empire, what we are doing, we have no national at all reason in the Middle East. We have no national interest. We get 15% of our oil comes from there, and we could just as easily get it from somewhere else. But of course, Western Europe and Japan get most of their oil from there. I think, I don't believe that American administrations are very good at planning or indeed thinking, and they're generally rather ignorant. But I suspect that this is not only a message to Western Europe, but to Japan, that we are going to be a permanent military presence in the Middle East, and that's where the oil supply is. And I can see further down the road, we would absolutely collapse economically if every quarter the Japanese didn't come in and buy American Treasury bonds. I could just see the Bank of Japan dragging its feet, or the Bundesbank, and the United States clearing its throat and starting to talk about oil prices. And suddenly they will start buying our Treasury bonds. I mean, it's blackmail.
Well, I think that's...
Suddenly they will start buying our Treasury bonds. I mean, it's blackmail.
Well, I think that's... I don't entirely agree with that. I think there's another factor. It's true that we don't use oil from the very little oil from the Middle East, and as you say, we could get by with none. On the other hand, the profits from Middle East oil are a major factor.
Oh, the oil companies, yes.
Not just the oil companies. Not just the oil companies. The profits made by the client states. They equate. I mean, the way when Britain and the United States set up the imperial settlement for the region, the oil is the idea is, goes back to Lord Curzon, that you set up what Lord Curzon called an Arab facade, and that then Britain, but later the United States, would rule, would disguise absorption behind the veil of constitutional fictions like buffer state and so on. So you have this Arab facade, which is basically family dictatorships. They manage the oil system for us, but we make sure that we do have there's some leverage over pricing and production. We want that to be in our hands for exactly the reasons you mentioned. We also want to make sure that the flow of investments, of capital, of profits, is largely back to the British and American economies. Actually, we have documentary evidence on this. The documentary record's been cleared partially, at least, through about 1960. And it's very interesting to look at the declassified British and American records after the Iraqi Revolution in 1958. That was the first break in the Anglo-American condominium. So naturally they were hysterical about it. And Selwyn Lloyd flew over to Washington and talked to Dulles and so on and so forth. And they decided at that time to grant some kind of nominal independence to Kuwait to try to dampen the threat of another nationalist revolution there. And though they reserved the right, as Selwyn Lloyd put it, ruthlessly to intervene if anything goes wrong with this settlement. And the reasoning was that, at that time, particularly Britain, they were very concerned about that Kuwaiti investments had to, both Kuwaiti oil and Kuwaiti investments had to prop up this tottering British economy, and in fact prop up sterling altogether. Now, by the 1970s, the U.S. is in the same position. And it's not just the Japanese who buy treasury bonds. The Saudi Arabians buy them.
Do you realize what the average American listener to this program will think, hearing you people talk about the war in the Gulf? You're essentially saying that that what was seen on television was a mirage. That essentially the main arguments for the Gulf War were faked. Really what we're looking at are underlying economic profit-oriented reasons for pursuing this war in the Gulf.
Profit and power.
Profit and power.
And I would stress again what Gore said, diversion of the American public. I mean, the American public must look away from their own problems, exactly.
But this isn't the picture that most Americans have.
Why should it be?
What's
I mean, the
what's
media
going
are
on
doing
here?
their job, after all, and the intellectuals are doing their job, which is to prevent people from understanding what's happening.
I mean, I've just been speaking at Harvard, a pleasant and gentle place, but Harvard exists, as does CBS, ABC, New York Times, to give the viewpoint of the establishment that owns and runs the country. And they have a worldview which does not coincide at any point with any reality that anybody mildly curious can discover. I would say that probably what the people think on almost any subject has been doctored for. Sanctions were working against Saddam. The problem was that 90% of the people, when asked if they think sanctions were working, didn't know what the word meant. A few Roman Catholics thought that a sanction was a step towards sainthood, somewhere after beatitude and before. The rest of them had no idea at all.
What about the debate in the U.S. Senate about should we authorize the war or not? One saw a real medley of voices, points of view there, didn't we?
Well, you certainly saw some quite good speechwriters had been called in, I must say. There was eloquence. Many people who could not parse a sentence were giving rather nice speeches. No, what you saw was the total collapse of our constitutional system of government, in which only Congress may declare a war. Bush at one point said what I've been saying for years. Why, he said we've done armed intervention 220 times and only 5 times have we ever declared war. I've been saying this and they've been denying it. Now,
why shouldn't we be praising George Bush now? Because he actually decided to follow a legal route to pursuing this war.
That's not
and he also brought into the coalition so many other nations. He didn't act unilaterally.
Neither of those statements is accurate.
No, it was.
I mean, the coalition was the United States and England. In fact, up until January...
What about France?
Up until January 15th, it was a U.S.-British command in the Gulf. After it became clear the war was going to go on, France, Italy, and a couple of other countries decided they'd like to get their fingers in the post-war settlements and the
3 days before we started.
But it was a U.S.-British command, and it was a U.S.-British war. Very isolated in the world. It's true, the famous 28 countries that were in the coalition, most of them were there to enforce the sanctions. In fact, and as far as the legalities are concerned, the U.S. just once again did what it's been doing for many years, namely undermine the United Nations. The United Nations has procedures, and they were blocked.
But didn't we get a UN resolution?
No. Well, we notice what the resolution said. We got a resolution in which the UN said, in effect, we wash our hands of the matter.
Why would they do that? Why would so many countries just fall back and take a back seat?
The United States is a very frightening place. You don't fool around with it. This is what's been happening in the UN for years. Let's just take the period during which George Bush has been in national prominence. He was appointed UN ambassador in February '71, so they take that period. During that time, the United States has vetoed about 2/3 of the Security Council resolutions that have been vetoed by the United States. About half of the rest have been vetoed by England, United Kingdom. That's between them. That's about 80%. Way down in third place is France, and fourth is the Soviet Union. The United Nations, the same as in the General Assembly. I mean, you get votes in the General Assembly like 150 to 1 or 140.
We've also placed
2
ourselves outside the law. We made it very clear over Nicaragua when we were called before the International Court at The Hague, which we'd helped set up at the beginning of the century, over mining the Nicaraguan harbors, and we said we don't recognize the court at The Hague.
No, we're rejecting. Right now, we're rejecting reparations. This is the one country that's rejecting reparations. Meanwhile, calling on Iraq to pay reparations. But in this current case, if you look closely at what happened at the UN, I think it was another case in which the United States and its English lieutenant succeeded in subverting the United Nations. I mean, the UN response was pursue sanctions and diplomacy as usual effort after any act of aggression. It usually is blocked right away by the United States, which vetoes it or undermines it. But look what happened. The United States intervene directly to block diplomacy. I think sanctions probably already had worked. I mean,
But you know, we didn't have to go for, in the past, the American presidents wouldn't have gone for UN support in any case.
Yeah, but look, this was a
Isn't this a turning point for the American empire?
No, it's a big operation. I mean, this is not like invading Panama, where we don't ask anybody what they think. We just invade Panama. This is 500,000 troops in the most sensitive area of the world, which everybody's concerned about. You have to get at least the pretense of the cover of support. And in fact, after a lot of arm twisting and pressures and threats, they succeeded in getting the Security Council to abdicate. That's in effect what happened.
It's the old frog in the pan thing. If you put a frog in a pan with water, cold water, it'll sit there. You can heat it up until it becomes boiling, and the frog will feel nothing. As it is happening so gradually, the frog adapts to each change of the water. The end of it is a dead frog. But he has not had any anxiety about it. Well,
so
I sometimes think our people are the frog in the pan, that things are going very badly for the economy, for the average person, and no one's doing anything about it. And we have the politics of diversion, which are foreign adventures, and we have a irresponsible, to put it mildly, press.
Has the empire really run out of gas? I mean, are we at the end of empire now? Or are we just in a middle phase? Do we have another 50 years of diversionary tactics abroad?
Oh, the empire ended in 1950 when we were defeated in Korea. That was really the end, and the Russians got the atomic weapons. There was then parity. Once there's parity, you're not the world empire. You may be a world empire.